Over the last 10 years, I have slowly made my way through almost everything that Dan Simmons has written, and I'd like to share my progress. So far, I know there are only 2 fiction books that he's written that I do not have in my collection. That would be Love, Death, and Worlds Enough in Time. And neither of those I have. I'm very anxious to get both of those. I had Love, Death at one point, but I ended up giving it away. And that was long before I tried to actually collect everything. That was before I found out that I really enjoyed Dan Simmons as much as I do. I've never owned Worlds Enough in Time, though. So I'm just going to discuss all of the books that I own by Dan Simmons today, because I love Dan Simmons and I want to talk about Dan Simmons. So just perhaps minor spoilers on just about every single thing that he's written. I'm not discussing these in any particular order. As a matter of fact, I had my wife randomly arrange all of the books behind me, so I'm not exactly certain what order they're going to be in, other than the series are going to be put together. The Joe Kurtz series is going to be together. The Hyperion Cantos is going to be together, so on and so forth. Drood was actually the first book by Dan Simmons that I read. This was the first historical fiction book that I ever read. I absolutely loved Drood. It was really slow in some places. It was very well researched, so there's a lot of time spent just learning. This is from later in his career. This was originally published in 2009, and I read this in, boy, I want to say it was maybe 2016 that I read it, so I was about 7 years late to the party, but I did thoroughly enjoy it when I got around to it. Next up is The Hollow Man, and as I was reading through The Hollow Man, which was, again, about 2016, maybe 2017, I gotta admit, I didn't particularly care for it when I first got into it. I thought it was kind of a hot mess. There was a lot of elements that I didn't think really worked together, specifically in the middle of the novel. The middle of the novel really felt kind of ugly. But then we got to the end of the book, and the end is one of the more emotional endings, for me at least. When he meets Robbie, when he, when the world is kind of constructed for him and he's able to kind of get his wife back a little bit. Man, that's really where this story is beautiful. When Jeremy Brennan meets his wife for the first time, that is one of the most impactful scenes. This does have some of the more excellent moments Dan Simmons has ever written. It also just has some of the more confusing, why did you bother putting that in here? This was based off of a short story that he wrote. It was called Eyes I Dare Not Meet in Dreams, which was in Prayers to Broken Stones. We'll get to that one in a minute. That short story he expanded into The Hollow Man, and I've now read both the original short and the novel here. I do think I actually enjoy the short, but we'll get there when we get there. Oh man, okay, The Abominable. This is one of the few Dan Simmons books that I just don't like, actually. This one, I did not finish it, I will admit. I got 550 pages into this 700 and some odd page book. It was a slog. This book is like climbing a fucking mountain. I think I'm probably going to get back to trying to do this one again at some point. I want to read everything by Dan Simmons, but oh my god, I really don't know if I'm going to be able to make it through this. This one I really do own just so I can actually have it in my collection, so I can have the full Dan Simmons collection and, fucking tickle my own ego for a second. All of his stories at least have some merit to them, even if I don't like them. This one, boy, I do actually struggle to find any of the merit in there. It was very well researched as usual. The characters were very drawn out. That was actually probably the worst part of the book. He spends too much time getting to know who the mountaineers are, and we spend too much time learning about the very specifics of mountain climbing. It was so boring that I gave up before the Yetis showed up, or the Abominable Snowmen showed up, or whatever. I thought that I was going to be getting into the Terror, so I thought there was going to be some really cool action-paced scenes. I thought there was, the Terror is a much different reading experience than this. That was also historical fiction. This is historical fiction, and it just left me wanting so much more that I ended up giving up. It's one of the 2 Dan Simmons books, this was one of the 3 Dan Simmons books that I did not actually make my way all the way through, one of which was Love, Death, that I mentioned earlier, but unfortunately do not have any longer. The Abominable, not my cup of tea, at least not the first try. Children of the Night. This is one of 2 vampire stories that Dan Simmons did. This and Carrion Comfort. And this one is, man, it's a lot tighter. It's a lot shorter than Carrion Comfort, and it tells a much different kind of vampire story. It focuses a lot on Vlad the Impaler and how that turned into Dracula mythology, and that ties into this book so very well. Dan Simmons, of course, always does wonderful research, and so he brings these age-old mythologies and a lot of this history alive with his characters and with his novels here. The main character in this one, Kate, she is, she was one of the more standout characters for me. I really felt the love between her and her adopted child. Like, you really feel the love that she has. She goes through hell to try and protect her newborn kid, and it was a damn solid read. So it looks like my wife put the two vampire books together. So Carrion Comfort is Dan Simmons' other vampire book, and oh man, this might be, in my opinion, one of his two best stories that he's written. There's one other story that I think has the chance to equal, perhaps surpass Carrion Comfort. We'll get to it in a minute, but this one, when I read it, after I finished it, I was fucking mortified. I was horrified with some of the stuff that happens in this book. This book is true horror. I don't know what corner of hell Dan Simmons found this text, but he dragged it kicking and screaming to the fucking surface to show its horrified glory to all of us. I hate this book as much as I love it. This is one of the few books that I've actually lost sleep over just because of some of the shit that happens in it. Dan Simmons is a fucking savage. I actually have a bit of a hard time suggesting Carrion Comfort because it is just pretty brutal and unrelenting at times and really pretty pessimistic for most of the book. Then again, you also get some of the best characters that Dan Simmons has ever written. Saul is such a wonderful, not to be confused with Saul Weintraub, Saul Lasky in this book. Oh my god, he's a wonderful character. The sheriff is wonderful. Willie is horrifying. Melanie is terrible. God, she is just so fucking horrible. There are so many just juicy... Oh, Tony Harrod. I fucking hate Tony Harrod. I've wanted to reread this one for a while, and I've honestly just put it off because, man, it gets heavy. Prayers to Broken Stone. I'm actually reading this one right now. I've finished the first 3 stories in there. The first story was okay. The second story was Eyes I Dare Not Meet in Dreams, which was the setup for Hollow Man, was the short story, which Hollow Man was based on. The third story, though, Vanny Fucci is alive and well and living in hell, might be the single funniest fucking story I've ever read. I hope the rest of the stories in this book are even half as good as Vanny Fucci is alive and well and living in hell. That shit was hilarious. We're on a good trajectory, at least. Next, I have Flashback. This one here is interesting. I did read The Hollow Man before I read this, so I guess this would be the second science fiction story that I read by Dan Simmons, and I did enjoy it. There were a lot of really interesting aspects. The politics in it are odd, but you know, it is what it is. My father would not miss the chance to say that this is his favorite of Dan Simmons that he's read so far. I would certainly say that it's not my favorite Dan Simmons, but it is at least a solid read. There's some really interesting imagery in here. Some of the weird sci-fi world building is just pretty spot on as well. The ending was pretty good. The drug flashback, right, the titular drug flashback that lets you relive the memories of your life perfectly, you know, specific memories that you can zone in on. That drug was actually, so far I can tell, it actually started in the Hyperion Cantos. Let's see, I think it was... Hold on, gotta rack my brain here for a second. The Poet's Tale in Hyperion, they actually mentioned Flashback very briefly. I read Hyperion after I read Flashback. Hyperion was actually one of the last things that I read by Dan Simmons, honestly. And so it was really interesting to kind of get that retroactive reversal. So I bet it was pretty interesting for a lot of Dan Simmons fans who'd already read the Hyperion Cantos to see a whole thing about Flashback. Although I wonder if some of them were just like, holy shit, this is going to be connected to Hyperion. And no, this is not actually connected to Hyperion. It just seems that they took the same mechanic, that drug, Flashback, and reused it here. The Fifth Heart is okay, honestly. It's a little, honestly, below par. However, below par for Dan Simmons is still better than almost anything most other writers are going to be able to put out anyway. It's not that it was a bad story. It wasn't. It's not that it was poorly written. It wasn't. It's not that it was even poorly researched. It wasn't. It's never the case with Dan Simmons. None of those are ever the case with Dan Simmons. However, it just wasn't a book for me. I've tried getting through some Sherlock Holmes, and man, it's just a bit difficult. I've at least not found any Sherlock Holmes that I've been able to read through so far. I've seen a couple of the movies. You know, I've seen the Robert Downey Jr. ones. I've seen young Sherlock Holmes. I've seen other Sherlock Holmes and stuff. It's just, the actual Arthur Conan Doyle texts were always pretty hard for me to digest. The age gap there is a bit difficult for me. I read this because it's Dan Simmons, and I love Dan Simmons' work, so I suffered myself through this. It just wasn't really my kind of story, so take whatever I have to say with a grain of salt. It felt pretty disjointed, kind of wandering. A few of the mechanics in the book weren't ever exactly utilized to their maximum capacity. The fifth heart just wasn't for me personally. Hyperion. This is, from what I know, probably Dan Simmons' most well-known stuff. I mean, first of all, there are 4 books in this series, so it's just by sheer volume, the most probable thing that people are going to stumble across when it comes to Dan Simmons. Not to mention, these are the books that I believe he's actually won the most awards for. This one certainly did win the Hugo at the very least. It's broken up into 4 different short stories. Well, 4 different novellas, if you will. I have a longer video on each of the Hyperions, except for the final one, that I discuss a little bit more in depth about. And this was one of the last things that I read by Dan Simmons. Not the last, but it was one of the last, was the Hyperion Cantos. And comparing it to the other stuff in his work, I think the Hyperion Cantos is not the best thing that he's written. It's really good, the world building is fantastic, the characters are amazing, but man, comparing that to like Carrion Comfort, Hyperion's good, but it's just not quite as good. It's just not Dan Simmons at his absolute peak best. He does that elsewhere. We're on to The Fall of Hyperion. This is the sequel, of course, to Hyperion, and this book is much better than the first one, in my opinion, personally. This book is almost inseparable from the first one. You kind of have to read them together because they were, from what I understand, intended to be one large book, and they just kind of got split into 2 for, you know, probably I'm assuming because the publisher shat a brick at the large size of the book, but maybe not. I'm not 100% sure. That happens a lot to Dan Simmons, actually. His books kind of seem to get broken into multiple pieces sometimes, specifically with his science fiction. Again, I have another video discussing this one, so we won't go too in-depth here. This one was kind of interesting because I got to learn quite a bit more about John Keats and how that actually ties into the story more itself. We got to meet more of the characters. Endymion was a step in an interesting direction. I'm not 100% sure if it was a step in the right direction, but it was an interesting step at least. Definitely gets a bit creepy at times. Again, I discussed that in its own video. I do love the cover art on this, though. I do like Rahl as a character. Rahl is a very fun character. I do like Ania as a character. She's a pretty fun character. Really appreciate that they brought the cruciform back for this book and for the book that follows this one in the Endymion duology, I suppose. I'm really glad that they did, because oh man, Dan Simmons underutilized the fucking cruciform in the first Hyperion book, the Rise of Endymion. I made videos on the other 3 Hyperion stories, and I got stuck on this one. I've not released it, not because I haven't read this one. I read it like, God, almost 2 years ago at this point. I don't know how to approach this one, because in some ways, I really loved it. This is one of the few books that actually got me to cry. On the other hand, 1, there are a number of uncomfortable things in this book. 2, it's really, really slow and boring a lot of the time. We talk so much about just buildings and all sorts of crap. This book is extremely long as is. They needed a much stronger editing hand on this book to chop it down even closer to the even closer to the last book size. I mean, this one's like 100 pages longer than Endymion is. The last one was a 530-page trade paperback. Like, these are not short novels. He really could have thinned them down. Granted, the plot points that he did write about in this book, the plot points that weren't creepy and the plot points that were actually, like, moving, were really fucking moving. This book is very divisive amongst the Dan Simmons community, and I can certainly understand why. Taking a break from his absolute ridiculous science fiction, we're going to move on to The Crook Factory, another piece of his historical fiction. This one was really not what I was expecting. I didn't think I was gonna like this one too much. This was one of those ones that I was reading under the principle of, oh, it's Dan Simmons, it's probably gonna be a good story, so let's give it a read. This one's very middle of the road Dan Simmons. It's far from the best, but also far from the worst. You know, it's a historical fiction book by Dan Simmons, so he's probably going to use actual historical people for most of the main characters, as he does in this book. It was very informative in a lot of ways. I don't really think about this one too much when I think about Dan Simmons. It was maybe the only purely okay book that Dan Simmons ever wrote. It's not bad, it's just, compared to the rest of what he's written, a little flavorless. The subject content is just so, I don't know, realistic. I don't know. I like Dan Simmons' fantasy and science fiction and horror stuff a lot more than his realistic stuff. And the Crook Factory really edges pretty purely realistic the entire way through. Even though he can pull it off, Dan Simmons can definitely pull it off, it's just not my preferred reading experience. Back to the science fiction, baby. Now this right here, Illium. Illium and Olympos are one of those duology books, right? You know, it's a science fiction duology. They could be one gigantic story, they just got split up into two. Illium being the first half of it, I actually do think I liked Illium better than I liked Olympos altogether, but both of them were freaking amazing. This is top tier Dan Simmons. These, Illium and Olympos, rival Carrion Comfort in how good they are. Just like, holy crap, really fucking good novel right here. And then, of course, here is Olympos. This is the second book, and my goodness, this one got a little bit interesting. It switched up its format a little bit from the first one. In the first book, you got Thomas Hockenberry narrating quite a lot of the story, first-person point of view, and there is not. Thomas Hockenberry does not narrate first-person at all throughout this book, so far I can remember. Maybe he does, and it switches out for a lot of the book, but generally speaking, from what I can recall, I actually think maybe everything in this book is totally third person, which is actually a little bit interesting for Dan Simmons. Dan Simmons really likes to inject first person into his works. However, this is like almost an 800-page novel, so maybe I just done forgot. Now, obviously, of course, he uses like first person for dialogue and shit like that. I'm talking specifically the narration, not the dialogue. We are on now to Hardcase. This one is a bit lower on my rankings for Dan Simmons' books. He's done many novels that were better than Hardcase. Now, its best attribute, of course, it is very short and very fast-paced. This book does not slow down. You will never be bored throughout this book. I don't know, I just didn't quite care for Joe Kurtz in this book here. However, as the series went on, that did change a little bit, but in Hardcase itself, it just didn't blow me away too much. Next, we have Hard Freeze, the second in the Hardcase trilogy, the Joe Kurtz trilogy, if you will. This is probably my favorite in the series. This is actually where it kind of clicked for me. I never really did, crime books, but this one here, yeah, I don't know, it really, the captain, the antagonist felt really well written to me, and Joe Kurtz finally grew on me reading through this one. Next in this trilogy is Hard as Nails. This was a slight step down from the second one, but still significantly better than the first book in the series. After I finished the first book, I actually was I almost considered not finishing this trilogy, but I decided to go ahead and do it because, it's Dan Simmons, and of course I'm going to. But I gave it a go, and honestly, it was pretty decent. It was a little bit longer than I wished it was. I wish the pacing on this one still could have tightened up just a wee little bit. I was definitely sad about the whole Peg O'Toole thing, and the ending was definitely a bit somber. He breaks the ending tradition. The first two books end with Joe speaking with his secretary about something, in kind of a lighthearted manner, and he breaks that for this book. He breaks that streak for this book and does something different for the ending, which is fine, but I almost wish that we really did get to end with him and his secretary having their conversation. Hard as Nails, better than the first book, not quite as good as Hard Freeze. Black Hills was an interesting read. I either read this one right before or right after The Hollow Man, and I thought it was interesting. There was a lot more sex in it than I thought there was going to be. It was an interesting historical piece. I got to learn quite a bit about South Dakota that I didn't know I was going to learn about. It's definitely an interesting idea, putting General Armstrong Custer into the head of a Native American man, but you know what? It definitely made for an interesting reading experience, so Apparently, Dan Simmons had to stop writing for an entire, like, 2 weeks because he had to figure out which direction the Ferris wheel turned at the World Fair that is featured inside this book in, I think, Chicago. I think it was the Chicago World Fair. However, it turns out that all of that research was for naught. You know, like, or yeah, he got conflicting reports. Some said that it turned clockwise, some said that it turned counterclockwise. In reality, it was one of the very few Ferris wheels that was geared to turn both ways. A Winter Haunting. This one, I enjoyed A Winter Haunting a lot more than I thought I was going to. This is one of the 4 books that is in the very loose Seasons of Horror series. It's not exactly a series. Calling it a series would be wrong, because honestly, they're all just loosely interconnected. They feature the same characters, or at least some of the same characters between this and 3 other books. Children of the Night is one of the other books that is associated with this one, but only very loosely, only because these characters that were in this one and in Children of the Night showed up as child characters in a different book. We'll be getting to that one later. It was a very quick read. Not too much happened in here, but it was very interesting. I liked the structure, specifically how the haunting kind of worked. The narration, specifically. It was one of Dan Simmons' more interesting novels, even if not very much happened in it. Phases of Gravity. This is one of the last books that I read by Dan Simmons here. This one it's one of his shortest novels that he wrote. It's just about an astronaut learning that he's been kind of a bad father throughout his life. You know, like, this guy who is able to literally make his way to the moon and walk around on the moon doesn't know how to get down to Earth and talk to his kid. Right? You know, that's the general metaphor of the book. And, I don't know, it was one of those weird reading experiences. I didn't expect to like this book very much, but there is some very powerful imagery in here. This is Dan Simmons going general fiction on us, right? Normally, Dan Simmons is all over his genre work. He does horror, he does science fiction, he does fucking fantasy, he just does all this weird, ridiculous stuff, and then he's got this book about parenthood. And, you know, failed parenthood at that. So it's just really interesting, in my opinion, that he was able to squeeze out a book that I really genuinely liked, even though it's a subject content that I would normally never seek out for myself. And this is the book that started it all for Dan Simmons, Song of Kali. This was his, or Kali, I don't know how to pronounce it. This was his first book that he published. I did not finish this book. I got about halfway through, and I was just bored, man. Like, nothing really happened, and I was halfway through the book. Stuff was starting to get a little bit creepy, but by that point, I just didn't really care. I'm gonna go back and try to read this book at some point, but oh god, I was honestly even more bored with this one than I was with The Abominable, because, you know, again, with The Abominable, at least I was able to make it 500 pages. I was only able to make it like 150 pages through this 300-page book right here. I was just bored to tears with Song of Kali. I am not looking forward to trying it again, really, but I'm probably going to try and make myself anyway. Darwin's Blade. Now, this one is kind of interesting. This one was pitched to me as more or less his comedy work, which I was very surprised about. Breaking it open and just looking at the title of the first chapter, I realized that, oh yes, this was going to be fucking hilarious. And I mean, you know, it definitely was. There was lots of really funny things that happened in it. This one is also loosely inside the Seasons of Horror, because one of the characters from the, one of the Seasons of Horror characters does show up inside this book as well. I can't really say that it's a season of horror, though, because it's not a horror novel. There's definitely some bloody grossness that happens inside this book, specifically the scissor lift, but yeah, it's not a horror novel. Darwin's Blade, one of my lesser favorites. The Terror. This was actually the second book by Dan Simmons that I read. The first one, of course, was Drood, which we started the video with. This one was my second, and this one I liked way better than Drood. By the end of this book, I knew that I was going to really just need to track down more Dan Simmons. The end was neat. Not what I was expecting, but it was neat. The action in here is really interesting. Oh man, the setting in the Arctic North. Oh my god, that must have to suck. The Fires of Eden. This is one of the other books in the Seasons of Horror. This one is set on Hawaii, which was interesting to me because that's where I happen to be born. It was really interesting to learn a lot about the Hawaiian mythology and stuff. It was really, really kind of fun to watch Trumbo, the main rich, the rich asshole that owns the resort in this book. Really fun to watch him just kind of squirm and squeeze sometimes. Really interesting how he worked in Mark Twain into the plot. That was kind of neat. Just a solid and fun experience, above par for Dan Simmons. Summer of Night. I've seen a lot of love heaped onto Summer of Night. A lot of people saying that it rivals Stephen King's It, and man, that is just not true. It's Summer of Night was okay. It was long, it was bloated. My favorite character died like halfway through, so I was just like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm just gonna spend the rest of this book with a couple of characters that are... Dan Simmons doesn't write kids well. I've never really... like, he can write a baby fine, but that's because a baby hasn't really grown a personality yet. That's probably the biggest thing about Dan Simmons. He knows how to write, like, 30-year-old white dudes. Everything else, he kind of struggles with. There was a lot of weird choices that he made in this book that I wasn't quite sure about. It didn't really feel like it all summed up together at the end. It just felt like kind of a mess to me. This is maybe my least favorite book of his that I've actually finished. I did not like The Abominable, and I did not like Song of Kali. And I also didn't like Summer of Night, but at least I was able to finish it. That is every single Dan Simmons book that I currently own as of right now. Again, I do have a few that I have not added to the collection quite yet that I really do want to get to. I could suggest you just about anything, any one of Dan Simmons' books. Not quite all of them, but just about all of them. One that I really feel that I have to suggest, however, is The Circus, an American Fantasy. That's my book. Surprise, I'm gonna sell you shit. Within, Penny Robinson finds herself trapped in an enormous, otherworldly circus where capitalism is king, crime runs rampant, and souls are currency. The only chance for survival is to abandon morality and bend to the whims of the circus dictator, or risk her life and break free from the system she's become trapped in. I have also got Portraits in Bloodlines. Portraits in Bloodlines is 23 short stories in the horror, slipstream, fantasy, science fiction, and other subgenres. There's plenty of everything for everyone in Portraits in Bloodlines. As you can see, I have a bunch of movies here in my collection. If you're curious about those, you can head to my wife's channel. She's currently documenting our collection process on those.